The letter took him less than 4 minutes. Piers Alton, 6th Duke of Crestwood, wrote it between a note to his steward regarding the drainage of the lower meadow and a reply to Lord Fairborn declining an invitation to shoot in September. The pen did not pause. The ink did not blot. He wrote as a man writes when the subject requires no particular consideration, efficiently, without revision. In the same measured hand, he applied to every piece of correspondence that crossed his desk. "Sir Rowan," he began, and considered for a moment whether the familiarity was appropriate before deciding it was not worth the thought. He had married the man's daughter 6 months ago. A Christian name would do. The letter was brief. He thanked Sir Rowan for the alliance, which had proven sensible in the matter of the adjoining lands and the settlement of certain debts that had troubled the Bourke estate for the better part of a decade. He noted that Sylvie had conducted herself without embarrassment, which was all one could reasonably expect from a wife of her station and temperament. And then, in a line he composed with no more deliberation than he had given the drainage, "Send her home, she bores me. I shall make arrangements for a household in Bath, or wherever you see fit. She will want for nothing." He sanded the page, folded it, pressed his seal into a disk of dark red wax, and set the letter in the outgoing tray beside two others, one regarding a fence dispute with the Clarkson tenants, and another acknowledging receipt of a shipment of claret from his wine merchant in London. Then he rose, adjusted his coat, and went to dress for dinner. He did not think of the letter again. It was not cruelty. That was the thing no one would have believed and everyone would have needed to understand. Piers Alton was not a cruel man. He had never raised his voice to a servant, never struck a dog, never humiliated a woman at his table. He was, by every account that mattered, a man of considerable decency. He simply did not see his wife. She had arrived at Crestwood Park in November wearing a dress the color of winter sky, and he had thought, suitable. That was the word his mind had produced, and it was the last word his mind had troubled itself to produce on the subject of Sylvie Bourke. Suitable. She managed the household without complaint. She appeared at meals at the correct hour, dressed appropriately, and spoke when spoken to with a quiet intelligence he registered the way one registers that a clock keeps good time, with approval and absolutely no curiosity about the mechanism. 6 months. 180-odd mornings during which she had sat across from him at the breakfast table, and he could not have told you the color of her eyes. Mr. Giddy found the letter at 6:30. Giddy was not, by nature, a man given to reading his employer's correspondence. He had served 3 houses before Crestwood, and prided himself on discretion the way other men prided themselves on horsemanship. But the letter to Sir Rowan sat unsealed in the tray. The wax had not taken properly. The seal had lifted at one corner and the fold had come loose, and when Giddy picked it up to sort the outgoing post, the page fell open in his hand. He read the line. He read it twice. And then he stood for a very long time in the fading light of the study, holding a letter he knew he could not send. He could not send it because he had watched the Duchess for 6 months. He had watched her learn every tenant's name within her first fortnight. He had watched her sit with Mrs. Nall for hours, going through the household accounts with a patience and precision that the housekeeper, a woman not given to sentiment, had described to him privately as a gift from heaven. He had watched her walk the east garden in the early morning when she thought no one was looking, her fingers trailing the boxwood hedges, her face turned up to the light with an expression that was not sadness exactly, but something adjacent, the look of a woman waiting to be seen by someone who had not yet troubled himself to look. Giddy set the letter back on the desk, not in the outgoing tray, on the desk, beneath a folio of estate papers, where it would not be found by anyone who was not looking for it. He told himself he would speak to the Duke. He told himself this every evening for the next 3 weeks, and every evening his nerve failed him, and every evening the letter remained where he had placed it, folded, sealed improperly, saying the unsayable in the most ordinary language a man had ever used to discard his wife. It was Tench who sent her to the desk. The steward needed a surveyor's report that the Duke had mentioned during their morning meeting, something to do with a boundary wall and whether the stone was worth salvaging. Tench had knocked at the study and found it empty. He had passed the Duchess in the corridor and asked, with the particular deference he always showed her, whether she might retrieve the document from his Grace's desk. "The 3rd drawer," he said. "Blue folio." Sylvie entered the study at 2:15 on a Tuesday in May. The room smelled of ink and leather. and the particular stillness that gathered in spaces a man had claimed so thoroughly that even the dust seemed to defer to him. She opened the third drawer. The blue folio was there. She lifted it, and the letter came with it, caught beneath the folio's edge, dislodged by the motion of the drawer, landing face up on the desk surface with the fold still loose where the wax had failed. She recognized her father's name. She recognized her husband's hand. And she read the letter standing in the thin gray light of an overcast afternoon, with the surveyor's report held in her other hand, like a counterweight. Send her home, she bores me. She read it once, all the way through. Then she read the line again. Then she stood very still for what might have been 30 seconds, or might have been 5 minutes. She could not have told you afterward. And during that stillness, something happened that was not breaking and was not hardening, but was something in between. A door closing, not slammed. Closed with care, the latch turned quietly, the bolt drawn without sound. She folded the letter. Not as he had folded it. She changed the crease, making the fold a 1/4 inch higher than the original, a difference so slight that only someone who had written the letter and folded it himself would ever notice. She placed it back beneath the folio. She closed the drawer. She took the surveyor's report to Tench and handed it to him with a smile that reached her eyes because she had decided, in those 30 seconds or 5 minutes, that it would. She did not mention the letter. Not that day. Not any day that followed. She mentioned nothing at all. What she did was begin to leave. It started with evenings. For 6 months she had sat in the drawing room after dinner while Piers read, or attended to papers at the small writing desk he kept by the window. She had embroidered, or read, or occasionally played the pianoforte. Quietly, nothing showy. Pieces she had learned as a girl that required no particular attention from either player or listener. Now the drawing room was empty when he came downstairs after changing. Her embroidery frame stood where it always stood. Her book lay on the side table, the ribbon marking her place. But her chair was vacant, and when he asked Mrs. Nall where the Duchess had gone, the housekeeper said she had retired early with a headache. This happened 3 evenings in succession. On the 4th evening, Piers did not ask. Then it was breakfast. She had always been there before him, seated, tea poured, a plate of toast set precisely at the angle she preferred, which he had never noticed was a preference. She had a way of buttering her toast that was particular to her, slowly, to the very edge of the crust, with a concentration that might have charmed him if he had ever looked up from his correspondence long enough to see it. Now her place was laid but untouched. The toast rack sat full. The tea grew cold in the pot. The small dish of lemon slices that the kitchen maid set out each morning, a detail Piers had never once registered, sat untouched, the pale yellow circles browning at their edges by the time the footman cleared the table. She had taken to eating in her rooms, Mrs. Nall explained, a change in her digestion, nothing to concern his grace. Mrs. Nall delivered this explanation with a face that gave away nothing, but her hands, folded before her apron in the manner she adopted when she was keeping her own counsel, were pressed together so tightly that her knuckles had gone white. She had carried a tray to the Duchess's room that morning, and found her sitting at the window in her day dress, perfectly composed, perfectly still, eating a soft roll with butter and reading a letter from her sister, as though the morning were ordinary and she had simply chosen to take her breakfast in a different room. Mrs. Nall had set the tray down and asked if the Duchess required anything else, and the Duchess had said no, thank you, with such warmth that the housekeeper had been obliged to walk very quickly back down the corridor before her composure failed her entirely. Piers was not concerned. That was the truth of it, and he would have admitted it freely if anyone had asked, though no one did. A wife who chose to eat in her rooms was not a wife in distress. She was a wife who had discovered a preference for privacy, which was, if anything, convenient. He ate his breakfast alone and read the morning's correspondence, and did not notice that the room was quieter than it had been, or that the particular quality of the quiet had changed, from the comfortable silence of 2 people occupying the same space to the hollow silence of a space from which someone has been subtracted. The public engagements were last. They had been invited to dine at Lanford Hall with Sir Edmund and Lady March, a long-standing obligation that Sylvie had managed the correspondence for since January. 3 days before the dinner, she informed Mrs. Nall that she would not be attending. A slight cold, nothing severe. She asked that His Grace's apologies be conveyed on her behalf and that a note be sent to Lady March expressing her regret. Piers went to Lanford Hall alone. Lady March received him at the door with an expression that rearranged itself so quickly he did not catch the first version, something startled, something pitying, before it settled into the practiced warmth of a hostess who has been managing guests since before her hair turned gray. She seated him beside her eldest daughter, a girl of 19 with a laugh like a bell and a gift for saying precisely what her audience wished to hear. He found the evening pleasant. He ate well. He discussed the new plantings at Lanford with Sir Edmund and debated the merits of a particular strain of barley with a neighboring squire whose name he forgot before the carriage had cleared the drive. He did not wonder, at any point during the meal, what Sylvie was doing in his absence. He did not notice that Lady March's eldest daughter glanced at the empty chair beside him, the chair that would have been the Duchess's, no fewer than 4 times during the fish course, with the particular fascination of a young woman storing information for later use. He did not notice that Sir Edmund watched him all evening with an expression that hovered between pity and bewilderment, as though the man could not quite believe what he was witnessing. A duke dining contentedly in a house full of company, apparently unbothered by the fact that his wife of 6 months had stopped appearing beside him in public. The household rearranged itself around the absence with the efficiency of water finding a new course. Mrs. Noll, who had run Crestwood for 11 years and had served the Duke's mother before him, understood what was happening before anyone else, perhaps before the Duchess herself had fully articulated it. She watched the quiet withdrawal with a tightness in her chest that she did not name and could not fix, because the Duchess had asked for nothing, complained of nothing, and conducted every interaction with the same careful courtesy she had shown since the day she arrived. That was what made it so devastating. There was no anger to address, no tears to dry, no slammed door to open. There was simply a woman removing herself from a life that had informed her, in the most administrative language imaginable, that her presence was not required. Piers noticed in stages. The first thing he noticed was the music. He had come downstairs one evening expecting, though he would not have used that word, the faint sound of the pianoforte from the drawing room. The silence that met him was not remarkable in itself, but it lingered, the way a scent lingers after the flower has been taken from the room. He stood in the corridor for a moment, listening, and then continued to his study without understanding what he had been listening for. The second thing he noticed was her garden. He could see it from the window of his dressing room, the east garden, the walled section where the roses climbed the old stone, and the gravel paths ran between beds of lavender that had been neglected for years before Sylvie came. She had not touched them herself. She was not a woman who knelt in the dirt. She understood the distinction between overseeing and performing, but she had spoken with the gardener, a taciturn man named Boyce, and together they had brought the beds back. Piers noticed one morning that the paths were empty. She had not walked there in over a week. The third thing he noticed was her voice, or rather the absence of it. The morning room had always carried a particular quality, not noise exactly, but presence. Sylvie giving quiet instructions to the maid. Sylvie speaking with Mrs. Noll about the linen rotation. Sylvie reading aloud from a letter her sister had sent, not to him but to the room, in the way people do when they are alive in a space and trust it to listen. Now the morning room was silent when he passed it. He found himself pausing at the door, his hand on the frame, before moving on. He paused there 3 mornings running. On the third, he went in and stood by the window where she used to sit. The cushion still held the faint impression of her shape. A spool of thread, pale blue, the color she used for the border of a tablecloth she had been embroidering since February, sat on the side table beside her workbasket. The needle was still threaded, tucked into the linen as though she had set it down intending to return in a moment. He touched nothing. He stood in her absence and breathed the faint residual scent of her, something floral, something clean, something he could not have named under oath, but which his body recognized before his mind did. With a lurch of unease, he attributed to the coffee he had drunk too quickly at breakfast. None of these observations connected. They sat in his mind like items on a list that had not yet been totaled, each one minor, each one explicable, none of them sufficient on their own to produce the growing sense of unease that settled over him the way weather settles over the moors, slowly and then all at once. It was the letter that completed the sum. He went to his desk on a Wednesday morning to retrieve a document he needed for his meeting with Tench. He opened the third drawer. He moved the blue folio. And there was the letter to Sir Rowan, which he had written and placed in the outgoing tray, and assumed had been sent and forgotten. It was here, in his desk. Beneath papers it had no business being beneath. He picked it up, turned it over, and noticed, with the precision of a man who folds every letter the same way, because precision is the organizing principle of his entire life, the crease was wrong. A quarter inch too high. The fold had been changed. Someone had read this letter. Someone had unfolded it and refolded it, and the difference was so slight that no one in the world would have noticed except the man who had folded it first. He sat down. He sat in his chair in his study in the gray morning light, and he held the letter in both hands, and the sum completed itself with a clarity that was physical, a sensation in his chest like a key turning in a lock that had rusted shut. Every absent evening, every empty chair, every silence where her voice had been. She had found this letter. She had read what he had written about her, and she had said nothing. She had said nothing, and she had begun with a dignity so complete it was almost invisible to do exactly what he had asked. She was sending herself home. The letter shook in his hands. He realized his hands were the thing that was shaking, and that the letter was merely the evidence of it. He read his own words, "Send her home, she bores me." And for the first time in his life, Piers Alton understood that a man could write a sentence that was true at the time of writing and have it become, in the interval between composition and discovery, the most catastrophic falsehood he had ever committed to paper. She did not bore him. She had never bored him. What she had done was something far more dangerous and far more quiet. She had existed in his house with such steady, undemanding grace that he had mistaken the absence of disruption for the absence of substance. He had looked at the calm surface and concluded there was nothing beneath it, when in fact the calm was the surface of a depth he had never troubled himself to sound. He found her in the garden. Not the east garden, she had given that up. She was in the walled kitchen garden behind the south wing, a space that had not been used for ornamental purposes in living memory. She was standing beside the espaliered pear tree, her back to the house, her shawl pulled around her shoulders against the cool of the afternoon. She was not doing anything. She was simply standing in a place where she did not expect to be found. He came through the gate. She heard him and turned, and her face did what it had learned to do in the weeks since she had read his letter. It composed itself, quickly and completely, into an expression of pleasant neutrality that revealed nothing and cost her everything. He did not speak. He walked to where she stood, and he sat down on the stone bench beside the pear tree, and he stayed there. The silence lasted a long time, long enough for the light to change, long enough for a thrush to sing its entire phrase from the wall and begin again, long enough for the shadow of the pear tree to move across the gravel path and touch the hem of her dress where it met the stone edging. When he spoke, he said, "I found the letter." She did not pretend to misunderstand. She did not ask which letter. She simply looked at him and waited, and in the waiting he saw for the first time the color of her eyes, gray with a ring of darker gray near the center, like the sky before it decides whether to clear or rain. "I am not going to ask you to forgive me," he said, "because the fault is not in the letter. The fault is that I meant it when I wrote it, and that I could mean such a thing only because I had not looked at you. Not once, not closely, not at all." She was quiet for a moment. Her hands were still in her lap, folded the way she folded everything, precisely, without excess. "You need not explain yourself to me," she said. "You wrote what you believed." "Yes," he said, "and I was wrong. And I know I was wrong, not because someone told me, or because I have been shamed into knowing, but because the house is different without you in it. I am different without you in it. And I cannot account for how a man can live beside a woman for 6 months and fail to notice that she is the reason every room he enters feels like a room worth entering." She looked at the pear tree. It was old, planted by his grandmother, trained against the south wall, its branches spread in the pattern of an open hand. Its blossoms had fallen weeks ago, and the small hard fruits were just beginning to set, green and private, holding their sweetness close. "I was not going to mention it," she said. "I know," he said. She turned to him then, and what crossed her face was not forgiveness, not yet, that would take time, but something that preceded forgiveness the way dawn precedes morning. Recognition. An acknowledgement that he had come to the garden not with an excuse, but with the truth, and that the truth, however late, was the only currency she had ever been willing to accept. They sat together until the light was gone. He did not take her hand. She did not lean against him. They simply occupied the same bench in the same garden and allowed the silence to become, for the first time in their marriage, the silence of two people who were choosing to remain. Mrs. Nall found them there when she came to announce dinner. She said afterward to Tench, and Tench repeated it to Giddy, who received the information with a relief so profound he had to sit down, that the Duchess had been sitting with His Grace in the kitchen garden, and that the Duke had looked at his wife the way a man looks at a letter he has only just learned to read. The return was not sudden. Sylvie did not reappear at the breakfast table the next morning with everything restored. She was not a woman who had been waiting to be asked back. She was a woman who needed to see whether the asking was real. She watched him. She watched him the way she had watched the household accounts, carefully, thoroughly, missing nothing. And what she saw was this, that the Duke of Crestwood, a man who had never in his life exerted himself to understand another person's interior landscape, had begun to pay attention. Not with grand gestures. He was not a man built for grand gestures, and she would not have trusted them if he had been. He paid attention in the manner of a man who has discovered that the most important document in his possession is one he nearly threw away. He asked Mrs. Nall what Sylvie preferred for breakfast. He learned that it was not toast, but a soft roll with butter and preserves, and that she took her tea without sugar, but with a slice of lemon that the kitchen had been providing without his knowledge for 6 months. He learned that she walked in the mornings not for exercise, but because the light at that hour reminded her of her father's house in Hertfordshire, where the east windows caught the sunrise, and her mother, dead since Sylvie was 14, had kept a window box of herbs that scented the whole room. He did not ask Sylvie these things. He asked the household, because he understood that the household had known his wife long before he had, and that their knowledge was a rebuke he deserved to sit with. He attended his sessions in the House of Lords that spring with a distraction his colleagues noticed but did not remark upon. He returned from London earlier than expected, declining Lord Fairbourne's invitation to dine at his club, arriving at Crestwood before dark with his coat still dusty from the road. Sylvie was in the morning room. She looked up when he entered, and he saw surprise in her face, the first unguarded expression he had seen from her in weeks, and he understood that surprise was itself a measure of how little she had expected of him. He sat down across from her. He asked what she was reading. She told him, a volume of Cowper's verse that her sister had sent from Hertfordshire. He asked if she would read to him. She looked at him for a long time, her gray eyes steady, and then she opened the book and began to read, and the sound of her voice in the morning room was like water returning to a riverbed that had been dry so long the stones had forgotten their own smoothness. The letter to her father was never mentioned between them. It sat in the third drawer of his desk for 3 more weeks before Piers removed it on a morning when the study was filled with early light. He carried it to the library where the fire had been laid but not yet lit for the day. He knelt on the hearthstone, a posture so unfamiliar to him that his valet, had he witnessed it, would have thought his master taken ill, and lit the kindling himself. He waited until the flames were steady. Then he fed the letter to the fire and watched it burn, the paper curling inward like a hand closing, the wax seal bubbling and blackening, the ink lifting from the page in a thin curl of smoke before the words themselves disappeared. Send her home. She bores me. The sentences consumed themselves from the edges inward, and when the last fragment of paper had turned to ash, he remained kneeling for a long moment, watching the fire do its ordinary work on the ordinary kindling, as though he needed to see that the world continued after the worst thing he had ever written had been removed from it. He did not feel absolved. He did not want absolution. He wanted only to ensure that the most shameful thing he had ever written could never be read again by anyone, including himself. But he wrote another letter. He wrote it slowly, over the course of several evenings, in a hand that was less steady than his usual script, because steadiness, he had learned, was sometimes the enemy of honesty. He wrote about the morning light in the east garden. He wrote about the sound of her voice reading Cowper. He wrote about the fold in the letter, the quarter-inch difference that had told him everything he needed to know and everything he had failed to deserve. He wrote that he did not know yet how to love her well, but that he knew, with a certainty that had come upon him like weather, that the house made no sense without her in it, and that he would spend however long it took learning to see what had been before him all along. He left the letter on her pillow. He did not watch her read it. He did not ask what she thought. He simply wrote what was true and placed it where she would find it, and trusted her to do with it what she judged best. She kept it. She kept it in the cedar box on the table beside the bed, the box that had been her mother's, that smelled of lavender and old wood, that contained the only things she considered too valuable to leave unguarded. His letter lay beside a lock of her mother's hair and a pressed flower from her sister's wedding, and a small ivory button from a dress she had worn as a child. She did not tell him this. He discovered it months later when he opened the box looking for a stud he had mislaid, and found his own handwriting folded carefully among the things his wife held most precious. He closed the box without taking the stud. He stood in their room for a moment, his hand on the lid, and felt something shift in his chest that was not guilt and was not relief, but was something like the sensation of arriving at a place one has been traveling toward without knowing it, the click of recognition, the sudden stillness of a compass needle finding north. Giddy resigned his post that autumn. He gave no reason beyond a desire to return to his family in Surrey, and Piers accepted the resignation with the formal courtesy appropriate to a secretary of long standing. But on the morning of Giddy's departure, Sylvie came to the front hall to see him off, something she was not required to do, something no duchess would have been expected to do for a departing secretary. She thanked him for his service. She wished him well, and she pressed into his hand a small package wrapped in brown paper that contained, he discovered on the coach to London, a fine pair of gloves and a note in her hand that read simply, "For your discretion, which cost you more than anyone will know. With gratitude." S.A. Giddy kept the note for the rest of his life. He showed it to no one. Their son was born the following spring, a boy with his father's dark hair and his mother's gray eyes, whom they named Rowan for her father, which Piers suggested and Sylvie accepted with an expression that broke open, for one unguarded moment, into something that was unmistakably joy. Sir Rowan Bourke traveled from Hertfordshire for the christening, and stood at the font in the Crestwood Chapel, and watched his daughter hold her child, and his son-in-law stand beside her with his hand on the small of her back, and did not know, would never know, because neither Piers nor Sylvie would ever tell him, that there had been a letter. The walled kitchen garden bloomed again that summer. Sylvie had spoken with Boyce about restoring it, not as a kitchen garden, but as something else, something private, a place where the espaliered pear tree could keep its old shape and new plantings could grow around it. Piers walked there with her in the evenings, the boy carried between them by a nursemaid who trailed at a discreet distance. The stone bench where they had sat in silence now held a cushion that Sylvie had made from fabric she chose herself, a deep green, the color of boxwood, the color of things that stay. On the first anniversary of the day she had found the letter, Sylvie went to the study. She opened the third drawer. The blue folio was still there. The letter was gone. She stood for a moment in the room that smelled of ink and leather and the particular kind of silence that had once meant absence, and now meant only that her husband was elsewhere in the house, attending to the thousand things a duke must attend to, and that he would return, and that when he returned, he would look at her, actually look at her, and that this in the end was all she had ever required. She closed the drawer. She went to find him. The afternoon was bright and the house was warm, and somewhere in the nursery her son was laughing at something the nursemaid had done, and the sound carried through the corridors of Crestwood Park the way sound carries through a house that has finally remembered what it is for. They arrive here, like a letter written at last and meant whenever they are ready, ever.